So I thought I'd just, so since we cannot have him here, Stefan, I just thought I'd show you a picture. So this is John Sinclair, and that's a picture we took at one of these Tuscan works, and of course this was one that we actually did in Saarbrücken with Tuscan works. Anyway, so and that is what we all looked like at the end of the course, and I have a feeling this year will actually be much worse on Friday, but good. So, Corpus Linguistics. I think I first need to explain a little bit what this is about. I thought I'd give you the spelling of it, corpus, and it's nothing to do with dead bodies at all. And a corpus, just to start with the definition, is a usually large collection of samples of naturally occurring language that is stored in computer-readable formats. When I say this to people, what I get is various things. So people would say, you're a computational linguist. And I say, no, I'm not really. Or that means you do distant reading. I also don't do distant reading. So this is stylometry, and it isn't stylometry. And you are a digital humanities person? And I think, okay, that is probably one I'd give them. So that is kind of in the area where this is. So what do we do in Corpus Linguistics? So we like counting, comparing, and visualizing a lot. And the guy whose language I like looking at is Charles Dickens, so you've got him here. So things that you can do is, you can then do word clouds of Oliver Twist, if you want to. So you can see which words occur quite frequently, like Oliver and Mr. and replied and things like this. And we've got these things around commercially, so people play around with word clouds for everything. You have seen when you come in the English department, there's a word cloud. When you go over to Elms Road, there's a word cloud. So it's very fashionable. However, you can also do other things. You can just really count the word and give people the frequency. So this is a word list where you have the most frequent word at the top. So you start with the and to off. And that is also Oliver Twist. Only Oliver doesn't appear that early on. You can also do something like this, and that is a keyword list of Oliver Twist, where you take the frequencies of the words in Oliver Twist and compare them to a large reference corpus to see which words are statistically more frequently occurring in Oliver Twist compared to what we did here is a corpus of 19th century newspaper articles that were published at the same time. And then you see that these are the words that are striking. Another comparison you could do is you could take all of Dickens's novels and then see which words are key in them individually, and then do key keywords to see which words are key shared across Dickens's novels. And then you get this kind of display. So the point I want to make is, give me something, I can show you what you like, okay? And the reason is to then think about, don't trust people who show you fancy stuff. Understand what is going on. And I want to show you a couple of these things to go towards this understanding. And in the summer school, we'll work until Friday to make sure everyone understands these things. So this here is what is called a concordance. And that is a concordance for the word I. A concordance is one of those things that John Sinclair spoke a lot about. Because his point was, you only know that much about language. You understand a lot more what is going on when you see a lot of language at the same time. Because when you see a lot, you can actually identify patterns. So if you look at this, you can see that I occurs together with London Eye, and that is then the Ferris wheel. Or I occurs a lot with eye cream and eye creams and eyeshadow and lots of stuff to do with eye makeup. Okay? You can already tell where this text is coming from. Then you have things like man's eye gouged out in something where people took the Sharia law quite literally and did an eye for an eye, and that resulted in this situation. You have things like eye implant, bionic eye, and there's no reason why they are there together. And then you have eye surgeons and eye tests, and I keep that for later. Eye tracking we'll also talk about. I was just glad that eye tracking made it in the garden. That is good. And then you can tell that I isn't always a noun, but I can also be a verb. So you can I corporate sponsorship, or you can I public sponsorship, or things like this. So the point I want to make here is that when you take a lot of language, you realize what the patterns are. And when you've got the patterns, you get an understanding of what words mean. So your understanding of the meaning of I is now a lot more complex than just saying, yeah, this is an eye, and preferably you talk about two eyes, okay? So eyes in the singular is already quite different from eyes in plural. Okay, so what? That is a question that John Sinclair liked to ask a lot. So that was actually this publication that Matthew mentioned, where we asked John to write an introduction. And you had to be really careful to ask John to write an introduction because he would be very critical. So he said something in this introduction. Empirical linguists are often criticized for having their eyes and ears so close to their data that they do not tackle any wider issues. They are always at risk of having their scholarly reports greeted with cries of, so what? And indeed, such a judgment is a professional hazard for all of us. Okay, so I thought we need to look at that professional hazard in a bit more detail. And now I understand why at some point Max Walsh made me health and safety officer at the University of Liverpool. So, professional hazard. You've seen this before, haven't you? Google Ngram. That is something that is becoming immensely popular. So what you can do is you can take some of those combinations of words that we had in the concordance, so you can take eye surgery, eye test, eye creams, and see how the frequency of these collocations has developed over time. So eye surgery is much more frequent than eye tests and eye creams, and you can also see how that developed over time. However, it's very important to then be quite critical about just looking at frequency data like this. And data scientists and statisticians have been discussing a field, or the beginning of a field, that is called culturomics. And there was an article that got published in Science that said basically, this is the application of high throughput data collection and analysis to the study of human culture. So the results are a new type of evidence in the humanities, and the challenge lies in the interpretation of the evidence. And then this Science article is 6 pages long, and then the authors claim that in these 6 pages they provide us with lots of new insights into lexicography, the evolution of grammar, collective memory, the adoption of technology, the pursuit of fame, censorship, and historical epidemiology. All on 6 pages with a couple of graphs, and then they say, this is the new way to understand how culture works. Then this goes for a while, and then in 2015 some other people, again no linguists in that kind of sense, but this time mathematicians, publish an article in PLOS ONE and say, our findings call into question the vast majority of existing claims drawn from the Google Books corpus. And that is referring exactly to this paper. And I just thought, I could have told you so. I mean, just ask the linguists. I mean, that's stuff that we've been dealing with like forever, and then we can't just by looking at Google Ngrams solve all those problems. However, an important point about this is that kind of, and I think that is a positive thing to take away from this, that the things that we do as corpus linguists got some attention from other fields. So there are data scientists, there are statisticians, there are mathematicians. They talk all about these things that we are also interested in. All we need to do now is teach them how to do it properly, but then they can use these things and do stuff with it. So another relation to a field is what's called distant reading. And that is very popular in circles around Moretti, where distance is described as a condition of knowledge. So it allows you to focus on units that are much smaller, much larger than the text. And then he says other things, and if the text itself disappears, well, it's one of those cases where one can justifiably say less is more. So distant reading is about having large collections of text and then again doing visualization, finding graphs, and then saying something about the literature in its entirety, not just 15 Dickens's novels, but everything you can talk about. This is quite in stark contrast to what people have referred to as close reading, because close reading focuses on a particular text. That's very much related to Richard's practical criticism. This went out of fashion a little bit, and especially for Victorian studies, people explain this with almost an obsession of all themes, big and social, that people focused on, and then went maybe a bit too far away from the text and talked too much about the historical context and the biographical information. Some people in that spectrum. And then that is something where Moretti then says, he really doesn't like close reading at all. And he said, it is basically dealing with a very small canon, and it is a theological exercise, very solemn treatment of very few texts taken very seriously. Okay, so you can see where he stands on this. Close reading in the digital age, again, seems to be becoming much more prominent again. So while it might have gone a little bit out of fashion, now that we read things on iPads, on computers, on the phone, in all sorts of bite-sized tweets, blogs, or whatever, people pay, again, more attention to close reading and say close reading is basically almost mindfulness applied to language. Mindfulness is another very popular term, and that is then used to say you really need to focus and concentrate on the text. So you realize I'm just giving you these things entirely without any bias and totally uncommented on, just for you to make up your own mind. And I'm contextualizing this a little bit with what you could look at as corpus theoretical context. In corpus linguistics, there were huge debates about is corpus linguistic theory or methodology, and there's some people here in the room with whom I could have a very long discussion probably until next Friday to say we disagree on this. And but I think even if you disagree on these things, if you look at what other people who are not corpus linguists are doing with the things that I think are really corpus linguistics, it is quite important to get your theoretical basis straight in this regard, to see why do we do the things. Because something that is very dangerous is just doing things simply because we can. I can do a word cloud and I can run a word list and I do it because I can show off that I can press the right button. But that is not the point. You need to have a reason for doing these things. So I think these 3 points are quite important in the sense that the way we look at language is very much that language is a social phenomenon. And that means we use language to do things. There's very little happening without language. And the fact that we do things repeatedly with language leaves traces somehow, creates evidence. This evidence is collected in corpora, and then we can see what the patterns are. If you produce text, people can study the text to see what's going on in them. If you then study them, you will find collocations, so things like eye cream or eye surgeon. You have collocations or textual patterns or relationships between lexis and textual position. And in corpus linguistics, we very often give huge priority to lexis, so where we focus on lexical grammar, or we look at discourse as representation, where we look at the terms that people use to talk about the world. Okay, the point I want to make here is that it is then very important to take a very critical approach to the available data and the methods. So also think about the relationship between different texts. Our texts may be related in a way that you wouldn't easily see if you chuck them all together in a corpus and just count words. Is there some directionality? Is there something that is happening within texts? Yeah? And that brings us to reading concordances. John Sinclair wrote a whole book on how to read concordances. So for him, reading concordance was a very fundamental thing. And that was very important in lexicography, where you then had to work out what are the meanings of words so that you can put them in a dictionary. A big question then, however, if you don't compile dictionaries every day, the question is which words in which corpus and with what purpose do you run concordances on? I was looking at I because I've been looking at body language in Dickens a lot, so then I've done a lot of work on various body parts to just see what happens with them textually. But you need to have a purpose to run a concordance. And to give you a little bit of the purpose for a lot of the work that I'm doing is that I'm very much interested in fictional people in Dickens. And that is theoretically situated in a context that looks at characterization as a process that kind of happens in the mind of the reader. Okay? And this process links top-down knowledge, so your knowledge about the world that you bring to a novel when you read the novel, where you think about people in the novel as they're people like me. They kind of behave like normal people. I assume that everyone in a novel has 2 eyes, unless the text tells me that we're on a weird planet and everyone has just 1 eye, everyone, and for no particular reason. And then you also have bottom-up signals. this is the information in the text that then triggers what happens with your world knowledge that you bring into the text. And Peter Stockwell and myself, we've talked about this in the relationship of corpus linguistics and mind modeling, so the creation of fictional minds and looking at how fictional minds are related to the minds of real people. So what I'm very interested in is identifying linguistic patterns that link the fictional and the real world, and not in a kind of realism kind of way, but thinking about it in terms of the language that we use to talk about the real world and how that language is different or similar from the language that we use in fiction to describe fictional worlds. And amazingly, this is very similar. Okay? So, the thing I like spending a lot of time with is the click tool that Matthew already mentioned. So that is something that we have here now at the University of Birmingham, where I work together with colleagues on trying to think about how can we make people do concordance searches on, first of all, Dickens, because I like Dickens so much, and then also potentially other fiction. So we've got a reference corpus of 19th century novels to look at. And what is so special about our application to corpus concordancing is that we don't look at texts in their entirety, but we have already annotated the text behind this web-up so that you can make a distinction between fictional speech, so anything in quotation marks that is potentially said by the characters or thought by the characters, and then anything that is outside of quotation marks, so it's more narration. Okay? And here in this slide, the red bits are bits within quotation marks, so that is our approximation to fictional speech. And then the blue stuff is what we call non-quotes, so anything that isn't in quotation marks is non-quotes. Okay, that is a first very rough distinction, and we're refining this at the moment, and I'll show you some examples of this. So what we've got is we've got annotation behind this web application that also very nicely runs on iPhones and iPads and looks really flash when you use it there, but don't use it all at the same time because that brings our server down. The annotation is what we have behind it, and things that you can then do is you can say, going back to what I showed you at the beginning about these key comparisons, saying is something significantly more frequent in one set of text than in another set of text, we can now do this within text. So we can take all the speech, so everything in quotation marks, chuck this basically in one corpus, and take everything that isn't speech, put it in another corpus, and then we do a key comparison to then see what are the words, what are the phrases that occur statistically more frequently in fictional speech compared to non-speech. Okay? So, and that is what Click can do for you, and these phrases are called n-grams, and here we're back to the Google n-gram viewer, or they're called clusters if you use Wordsmith terminology for this. And we put both up because I tend to use clusters, but if you have people who are not familiar with corpus linguistics, you need to call it n-grams so that they also understand what it is. So we've got both. So you can then do a key comparison, and what you get is, for instance, that if you say, I want to have all the sequences that are 5 words long, this would be then a table that you get as all the sequences that occur statistically more frequently in quotes than in non-quotes. So you have things like, what do you mean by, what do you think of, I beg your pardon, sir, very much obliged to you. And these are such phrases that describe the speaker-listener world. So that is this idea of that when you have those little sequences, they are so frequent, going back to our point, language is a social phenomenon. We do things with words. We need to be efficient. We can't think of everything every time we say it. If we piece all the words together all the time, this takes forever. This will then sound like me speaking Italian or something like this, which takes a long time. So you need to build these sequences together. And the idea here is that the speaker-listener world then has a lot of things that are to do with pronouns. So what do you mean? What do you think? I beg your pardon, and things like this. So, and these occur more in the fictional speech, and you don't have them as much in the narration. But then in the narration you have other things. Okay, so the reason why certain clusters or n-grams are more frequent in fictional speech is to do with the functions that we have. And that is again the speaker-listener world. What do we do in spoken language? We tend to be polite to other people. And we don't reinvent being polite every time we want to do it. So there is very formulaic language. There are things that are set automatically. I'm delighted to see you. I'm glad to see you. How do you find yourself? Or will you have the goodness to... Yeah? And what we find here are phrases in 19th century fiction that are used as politeness phrases, which might not be the same politeness formula that we would use today, because this is all very... Yeah, it depends on which time period you're looking at, but you can get some good insights there. And importantly, also, I mean, I get this a lot. When you send an article to a journal, then these reviewers give you these. This is quite a nice idea, but actually you really need this to compare this to a real spoken corpus. And I say, that's a very good idea. Can someone show me a real spoken corpus of 19th century language? And I'll happily do this. So we can't easily do this. Therefore, it's actually a quite good approximation to say that especially these clusters bring us quite close to these functional sequences. So, and also another thing that I get a lot is when I talk about speech in fiction, then especially Victorianists, sorry John, not you obviously, but some Victorianists who can say, you do this boring thing with these speech tics, you know, in Dickens, where everyone has these repeated phrases and then there's one character that says the same thing all the time, and we know this without you checking this in the corpus. And so that's exactly the point, because I'm really not interested in these. I'm interested in phrases that are shared across fictional people. So not things that individualize one particular character, but phrases that occur across a whole lot of fictional people, so that you can get an insight into what are the typical functions that were socially relevant at the time. Okay? And an important point here is that the discussion of realism in fictional speech also was something that went a bit out of fashion, because people said, fictional speech is nowhere near like spoken language, because you don't have these ums and ahs, people don't interrupt each other, it just is very edited and tidy, so it's actually boring to study it because it is too different. However, Norman Page said part of the problem is that our understanding of what spontaneous speech is really like is quite inadequate. And now that we had spoken corpora, so contemporary spoken corpora, people have a much better understanding what real spoken language is like, and with this much better understanding from Corpus Linguistics, you can then also go back to fiction and see what are the similarities. You might not get exactly the same phrase, but we get a lot of functional similarity. Okay, so one example I wanted to show you here is that, and that's something you can get with Click as well. If you look at clusters, so something like "and all the rest of it," that is something that tends to occur in quotes, so in these quotation marks. And the places where it's then really, really interesting is the one or two times where it doesn't occur in quotation marks. Because if you have this tendency of normally something does this, and then occasionally, very rarely, we've got it here, then there's usually a specific function or specific effect in this. And this is from Bleak House, where you have from the village school of Chesney Wold, intact as it is this minute, to the whole framework of society, from the whole framework of society, the aforementioned frameworks receiving blah, 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 and then you have "and what not" in brackets, and then it continues, and you have "not minding their catechism, blah, blah, blah," the first station in which they happen to find themselves, and from that to their educating other people out of their stations, and so obliterating the landmarks and opening the floodgates and all the rest of it. This is the swift progress of the deadlock mind. What you have here is, you have actually the narrator talking. There aren't any quotation marks, but there are so many pointers that are really spokenness. So, "and what not," and then the "there" in capital letters to really give you the spoken emphasis, and then you have and all the rest of it. So these phrases that you would expect in a spoken language, and then you have it in a part that really isn't spoken. And Dickens even tells you, I mean, Dickens wasn't very subtle, was he? So he then said, and this is the swift progress of the deadlock mind. So he's actually telling you, you're now inside Deadlock's mind and see how he sees society and what he thinks are the horrible problems we need to deal with. Okay, so another thing we look at a lot, in especially in the CLIC project and in all sorts of other projects, is particular places of context of speech, and that is what we call suspensions, where you have the speech of a character, and then this is interrupted by the narrator coming in and saying something. So I would not mind Sir Agnes coming to me and speaking in a low voice, so full of sweet and hopeful consideration that I hear it now, and then the speech continues. So what happens in that way is the narrator can just slip in something. Instead of making a prominent big point, the idea is that you've got spoken language, and then you have some circumstantial information that is just slipped in. And then it's very interesting to look at what is the kind of stuff that is slipped in. And I started checking etiquette books and politeness guides of the time, because there's a lot about the tone and the voice that is always commented on. And I don't have that much time, so I don't read the top one, but there is a boisterous, loud voice, loud laughter, bold, I don't know why I don't tell, are sure signs of vulgar breeding. So you can see how what happens in the description in the novel is actually linked to contextual information. And I think that is something that, to just go back to these culturonomics people, was probably also missing there. You can't just take figures and run something and observe something. You always need to contextualize it and think about other complementary data sets to see whether you get some explanation for what you're finding. Okay. Another thing that you can do is, once you've got these suspensions, you can actually run concordances for character names. So in Hard Times, you can run a concordance for Mrs. Sparsit. And then you can see that things she does is rejoined Mrs. Sparsit with decent resignation, or set Mrs. Sparsit in a highly superior manner, or set Mrs. Sparsit with dignity, or in an impressive manner, or in a lofty sense. So what Dickens there does is, he gives you quite an idea of what he thinks Mrs. Sparsit is like, okay? But it isn't that he has got a sentence where he says, Mrs. Sparsit is a horrible woman, she is arrogant, and she behaves in a really lofty way. That's not what he's doing. He lets Mrs. Sparsit do her talking, and then he just sneaks in a couple of snide comments talking about her, and then you also get the idea. And then if readers aren't too brilliant on the uptake, there are then things where you have said Mrs. Sparsit making her nose more Roman and her eyebrows more Corellanian, so he's also talking a lot about her nose. And then you get into the text where you have something like, "What's the matter now, ma'am?" said Mr. Barnaby in a very short, rough way. "Pray, sir," returned Miss Sparsit, "don't bite my nose off." "Bite your nose off, ma'am," repeated Mr. Barnaby. "Your nose?" Meaning, as Mrs. Sparsit conceived, that it was too developed nose for the purpose. After which offensive implication, he cut himself across the breath and threw it down with a noise. Okay, so that is, if you don't get the subtle, then you also get the other bits. So, what we did, and here I got Pablo in because he came in when we started annotating suspensions. We are now trying to get some sense into these suspensions in a more systematic manner. So we've changed the click so that you can run the suspensions, and then this here is our user annotation. So we've got Pablo, Johan, Michaela, everyone is annotating like wild in this to just see what are the functions there. So can we find some patterns? Is there something that isn't just Mrs. Sparsit, but are the typical ways of Dickens doing horrible things to his characters, or making nice descriptions, or things like this? Okay. What we've also been trying to do is to get a handle on these things, and that's something I'm doing together with Andrew Solway, is we've tried out some local grammar induction algorithms where we thought, is there a way of, because what Pablo, Johan and I'm doing is very intensive work, because you read through all of this and then you try to think, how does this pattern look like, what could this be, and then you have a pattern and you spend 2 hours talking about it, and then you go through a whole lot again. And we thought, is there a way that there's maybe an algorithm that could help us sorting out the things? And what we're doing here is not just doing these clusters where you have sequences, but we're trying to look at optionality. So we have got equivalence classes where you could say, nodding, shades going, rolling, and then a possessive head, or alternatively with possessive head, so that you try to group stuff together to get a little bit of the optionality in, instead of looking at individual instances and then trying to see what you can get. So anyway, where that is, this whole business about body language and looking at body parts, where this is taking me at the moment is to then also consider the deformed body, disease and disability. And here again, body parts are really quite helpful. If you know that when you talk about eyes in literary text, you normally talk about two. If you then just find one, there is something to have a closer look at. So here you have Betsy Martin, widow, one child and one eye. Goes out showering and washing by the day, never had more than one eye, but knows her mother drank bottled stout and shouldn't wonder if that caused it, imaged here. Thinks it not impossible that if she had always abstained from spirit, she might have had two eyes by the time. Tremendous applause. The things that are really interesting here is, and that is what I'm trying to do in the wider context, is in literature you can get quite a lot of information in terms of what disease and disability was like at the time, very often in a funny way, but there's a lot of serious stuff behind this, because what they're really describing is fetal alcohol syndrome. That's like mothers drinking themselves into stupor while they were pregnant, and then people had to deal with this in some kind of way. And so what I'm trying to look at is what is in the literature in this regard, and looking at non-standard patterns of body part descriptions is a very good entry for this. Okay. And the way in which we put these patterns into a wider context is by looking what happens in the Times. So we can now access the Times Digital Archive, and thanks to the library, and I think Sarah was here somewhere as well. Yeah, there's Sarah, yeah, because we have got such a good relationship with the library that we can have Times Digital Archive not just in this interface that you access, but actually the data behind it, so that we can do corpus work with it. And then you can see whether any of these things that are hinted at in the literature have potentially patterns in newspaper articles of the time, so that you can get a sense of what was going on. And some of the things that I just wanted to hint at briefly, and that is work that we're doing together with a lot of people, and there's Simon, we've done this with Viola's over there. So we're trying to get a handle on, is there some kind of relationship between the way in which alcohol is being talked about and what people see in terms of alcohol and the health implications. So this is just to show you, now I'm doing exactly the thing that I was criticizing at the beginning. I'm showing you a nice visualization of how you can look at collocations, so which are the words that various types of alcohol occur together with, so that you have things like alcohol and drinking and alcohol problem, and then you have links over to risk and disease and cancer, and all sorts of relationships that you can find in this way. And that's what we're trying to look at in the Times Digital Archive. Another thing, because we have got the topic of reading, I hope you noticed that, the topic of reading is how you look at these patterns that you can find with the help of corpus methods. How do you question what these patterns are? How do you think about, I was saying I'm interested in mind modeling, thinking about how cognitive relationships and what you see in the text actually work together. So there was this thing about patterns and meanings are associated. Meaning is made by bringing in background knowledge and all the rest of it. Something that corpus linguists say a lot, they say, you can find these patterns, and corpus linguistics is so important because as a speaker of the language, you don't know what is frequent. You can't tell. If I ask you what is frequent, or if I ask you what was the most frequent thing you've been saying over the past 2 weeks, no one will be able to say this, because we're just not very good at judging what's happening. So, and what John Sinclair brought into that discussion is that he said part of this has to do with the fact that we kind of store prefabricated phrases. So we have these units that we then use without having to build them up individually, because it's just faster, it makes it more efficient. And then also language users are probably primed a lot, and that is stuff that Michael Hoey was talking about, primed a lot about the way in which they speak it. Anyway, what we wanted to find out, and that is work that I'm doing with Gareth, who's over there, and with Kathy Conklin, who's there on the picture, but in Nottingham, and we just had to get them to take a picture of the eye tracker. That is stuff where we're looking at how can we make observations on these patterns that we find in the corpus by looking at what happens when we read these patterns. So with the eye tracker you then can do things like this, give people a passage to read, and then you can see where they're looking at, how long they are spending on reading something. And we've done a couple of studies with this already in our brand new eye tracking lab, so a little promotional thing here. What we did is we looked at novels, and I'm particularly, to give you a little bit more context here, I'm particularly interested now in these novels in the 19th century. They were very much, and particularly Dickens, published in parts. And some of the things that people say about the findings on clusters is that these clusters occur repeatedly because people got like 3 chapters of the novel, and then there was this break, and then they couldn't read it anymore, and then they had to wait till the next installment comes out. So they needed something that then, once they got the next installment, reminded them of a particular character. So therefore you had all those repetitions. However, no one has really tested that yet. I mean, that is something that goes down very well. That's something that you read often, and the more often you read it, the more you believe it. But no one has actually tested this until now, because we are now looking at exactly this. So one of the clusters we've looked at is with his head against the wall, and that is something, again, we're in Bleak House still. There's this Mr. Jellyby, who during the whole evening sat in the corner with his head against the wall as if he was subject to low spirits. And there's something like a little bit of narrative progression, because you have several instances of him doing this. So poor Mr. Jellyby, who very seldom spoke and almost always sat when he was at home with his head against the wall, blah, blah, blah. So for him, this sitting with his head against the wall is basically a summary of he's in a very untidy household, he's got a horrible wife, he can never say anything at all, and all he can do is sit with his head against the wall. So that's a summary characterization of Mr. Jellyby. And so you could then claim and say, okay, if that summarizes his life, then if you hear with his head against the wall, that reminds you, if you haven't seen him for a while, that that is the guy. Okay? So what we then did is we made, so we did a reading study where we had undergraduates read basically a abridged version of Bleak House, where I'd just taken out all the passages where Mr. Jellyby is in. So instead of reading it really as the novel, we just cut everything else and had a little story that was just a story around Mr. Jellyby. And we gave this to participants to read this, to then see, does anything happen if they see this with his head against the wall several times? Or at what point can you see that they've actually remembered it, that they've learned it? So there are things that you can then do is, you could take the overall reading times for the cluster, so you measure how long does it take the participants to read this. What you can then also do is you can normalize this reading rate per character, and you can see where this is going. If you normalize this per character, you can then compare what happens. So you need to normalize, that's a basic Corpus Linguistics thing, so I don't go into detail. So anyway, and then you can also compare this to the reading rate per character for the whole text. So if you then see, these here are instances of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These are the instances of with his head against the wall. And you can actually see that there's a general trend that the more often you see it, you read it faster. And that goes together with a lot of stuff in the literature that says reading time is an indication of the relationship to memory. Have you seen this before? Have you learned it? And that is actually some good evidence to see that there is some learning going on. Obviously the correlation isn't entirely clean, so we need to do still a lot more studies and refine the experiments. But I think there is enough to show us that there's something worthwhile investigating. There is a trend, and actually there is a relationship between what we find on the basis of corpus data and what we find in other areas of linguistics that are not necessarily corpus linguistics. Okay, so with this result we can see that there's some kind of learning. There are some things in the peripheral aspects of it, and again I skip over this, we don't have enough time. What we also did is we then gave people follow-up questions, because we wanted to see, is it just the reading that we observe that gives us an indication of their learning this, or can we ask them questions about characters in the book? So we would ask them something like, how many characters were in the extract? What did the characters do? Where were they sitting? And can you describe the character in terms of adjectives and short phrases? And then I wanted them really to say there's Mr. Gentry and he is very sad and all these things. And it seems people are okay to give you information about the gist of it, but people will not say he was sitting with his head against the wall until you really point them to it. So if you have very biased question like, where is Mr. Gentry? What is he doing? Where might he be sitting? And you kind of get there, but it isn't so it's kind of people read it faster, they learn it, but they're not aware of it and they associate it with something else. Okay, so ongoing work is, because I don't have time, so I'll just give you a couple of things that we're doing to contextualize these corpus linguistics methods a lot more. So we are looking with people at questionnaires that have been filled in by vets looking at practice-based medicine to then see what kind of things do they talk about. What is it that they consciously, unconsciously might mention, point out. So we've done keyword studies, we've done some topic modeling things in that area. Then with Anna, I've been doing something on translation study, or with Lorenzo, we just finished, hallelujah, an article on translated cohesion, and then, the project that that you is leading on, where we want to look at John Donne's sermons, together with Paul. So there's a lot of stuff. Anyway, I had a lot of pictures of people here, and I couldn't give you all pictures, so I do one slide with a lot of people who are involved in a lot of this. And then there's this one person who would say, so what? So now I've been talking for 45 minutes, and then I had this with John a lot, and then I said, so, you've done all this? Where do we take this from here? Does anyone care? And I think people should care, because these fundamentals about corpus linguistics, how we understand meaning, how discourses are created, are also important in the wider context of what has to do with what people like to call digital humanities. Because I think one thing to take away from this is that there are a lot of similarities between disciplines, but they are sometimes just hidden underneath terminology that is disciplinary terminology, or sometimes fancy terms where people call things differently, and then you can't see immediately that you're basically doing the same thing, only in different fields. And if only you would talk to each other, you could actually do much better stuff together. So it's really important that communication across fields happens. So I think if the Google Ngrams paper, if that was a paper that had been submitted to one of the 3 corpus linguistics journals that are at present represented in this room, we've sorted that out, I think. So, and then there's things that, yes, the toolbox has changed. We can do a lot more things, but that doesn't mean we don't need good research questions. So we need to understand what it is we want to find out, and then try and make tools, try and get methods that answer the research question. And not just do something because we can, and it looks nice, and maybe someone will like it. But we need to have the question, and then we do what we can to get it answered. So we also need to be very critical of ourselves. Are we reinventing the wheel? I mean, that's the thing with the local grammar induction, where I'm currently trying to find out, someone must have done this. This sounds so good, that must be somewhere. So I need to find whether that's around and how you can make the connection. But also be critical of others, so don't be fooled by fancy visualizations. Only because you can't do a word cloud doesn't mean a word cloud is the answer to everything, okay? So, and I think that corpus linguistics as a field needs to have an impact on digital humanities more widely, because over the past 30 years we had all these discussions about theory and method, and is a corpus representative of something? So we would have never just taken Google Books and then made a claim on something, because people have talked about balance and design forever. Okay, so there are things that we have learned sometimes in the hard way over a long period of time, but that is still valuable, and maybe that can help if we then look at developments in digital humanities that are happening right now, and we can say we had a similar problem. The way we dealt with this is the following. And underlying all of this is that language is a social phenomenon. So this is also crucial in our understanding of the digital world. So a lot of this is really, how do people interact? What is it we find interesting? How do we conceptualize the world around us? And how do we bring this together? So I would say that we should really tackle these challenges and avoid professional hazards through collaborative work, ultimately. So I think Corpus Linguistics, for me, is very much collaborative, and I would hope that a lot of people in this room would think the same. So, thank you.